Hey everybody, Shay here, and I wanted to talk a little bit about Raven Nevermore and what influenced me to write the series almost 10 years ago. It's been hard to kind of get this episode even started because it's kind of the first episode, not really the first episode because there's like the whole welcome video, but that's me not knowing what the hell. Like I knew I was going to do something, but I didn't know what. I do have some ideas of content I could bring to this channel, but primarily I want to make sure that I get some ideas out there regarding Raven Nevermore and my influences, and just to give a bit of, like behind the scenes context for the creation of the comic, the experience through Kickstarter as a crowdfunding platform. That kind of content might hit the channel as well, and if not just Kickstarter, but like other crowdfunding ideas or my approach to crowdfunding and what it might mean. But anyways, let's get into what this episode is going to be about. I released an update on the Kickstarter for issue 2, and I came up with this idea of the retro fresh approach. I didn't know what term to use. I invented that one, and it seemed to work out for what I needed to convey. The point I wanted to get across with this one is the idea that what inspired me to get Raven Nevermore started. Mainstream comics, even in the early 2000s, they weren't that bad. Like I had left comics for maybe 15 years, and then I jumped back in around 2007, 2008, and I went hard again for about 3 years, and then I know exactly when it happened. And then the Marvel Cosmic Universe, like the Abnett and Landing, like left, and then something felt weird. Like I'm a big Darkhawk fan. But that's literally what brought me back in 2007 was his appearance in Nova 17, I think. Anyways, I'm derailing. The point being is that there was something going on that was really invigorating about that storytelling, the world building going on in Marvel Cosmic, and the tapestry that Abnett and Landing were building. And it felt finally like something cohesive that a new user, which is, there's some irony there because they played with continuity that went back like 50 years, but they were able to do it in a way where I could jump in, and I had some ideas because I collected comics for quite a while, but I had some ideas of things, but not that much. But they presented it in a way, and they started building this tapestry that felt like, oh man, it felt good, but then it got to a point where Guardians of the Galaxy movie, I think, was in production. It was going to come out, and then things started changing with Marvel, and they left the books, all of them, like, because I think they were architecting the entire cosmic, and so there was that I think I already said, there was that cohesiveness in the world building and the narrative, and because it was split off from all the other noise that was happening in Marvel with the Avengers and Spider-Man, and God, there was so many things happening, so many events happening that there was one moment in one of the comics, and I think it was Nova, where Nova comes back to Earth for an issue, and I think Civil War, the first one, is happening at that time, and he's like, what the hell, like, you guys have no idea what's happening up there, like out there, like this is nothing, this stuff happening on Earth is insignificant. And then he's just like, screw it, and he goes back because he's got like the massive war to like prevent, or like an invasion. I think this was during the Annihilation Wave or something. I'm getting really geeky, really off topic here, but the point being, is that Bendis then took over the book. I think it has something to do with the way Hollywood was kind of coming into play because the Iron Man movies, a bunch of Marvel movies come into production. But the point is, without me derailing much further, and to bring it back to the normies that are watching this channel that aren't really comic fans but are kind of intrigued by things, that's kind of the audience I want to talk to, just because that's missing. What's missing is like being able to attract a new audience. That's what the goal is, right? Is to attract new readers, is to get, but there's always this, they're bashing heads. The big companies are bashing heads with their motivations and their strategies. They want to attract new readers, but they're also messing with continuity that goes decades back, or they're completely disregarding it. And so the audience is never clear for the stuff they're trying to do. So, oh my God, let me roll this back. Let me try to be cohesive about this. That's probably something you're gonna notice with the content on this channel. I'm just gonna start pressing record and I'm gonna start talking, and that means that I'm not gonna be very coherent at times. I'll try to edit it so that it kind of comes across as something that makes more sense. But that's just going to be my approach to things, and I hope it just stays more authentic and more natural that way. So okay, so I'm going to roll this back again. I think I've said this 5 times, but the retro fresh approach. It's this idea of this is making no sense. This is making no sense. I feel like restarting, but I'm not going to. Not this episode. I'm going to keep going. The retro fresh approach. It's this idea of storytelling that harkens back to the bold, exploratory, creative ideas found in the comics in the 80s. Now, there's one thing to say, to stick to continuity, and then that's like, because you know your audience, and so you're targeting them, and that's who you're for. There's another thing with like finding a new audience, and so you have to disrupt everything because you're trying to get new people to come into comics and to have this fresh look, and they don't want that history, you know. But you can go back, you can explore more. If you're going to do that second approach where you're like, you don't care about the audience that's been established for decades, you don't care about the continuity that's been established, you want to take bold approaches, then take bold approaches. And that doesn't always mean doing things that you know are going to rile people up. It's not doing things in a way that's disrespectful to the characters. It's not allowing stuff to happen that's disrespectful to the company and the history that's been created. I mean, there has to be some sort of control factor from an editorial standpoint that I think is missing. I'm going all over the place again, but there's what I'm trying to say is that in the 80s in particular, there was this very exploratory nature for trying new things, and of course the comics were selling at hundreds of thousands instead of tens of thousands if you're unlucky, but the like selling hundreds of thousands, sometimes millions, right? Near the tail end of the 90s, the tail end of the 80s and early 90s, millions sometimes. So the market was completely different. And so the money coming in allowed you to take a lot more risks with characters. But that was fun, you know. Like, I collected comics from the late 80s through into the mid 90s, I would say, and they were fun because you would go to the comic shop and there'd be like new number ones, and number ones actually meant like this is a new character that's going to be ongoing. It wasn't miniseries, it wasn't 6 parts and canceled, it wasn't 5 parts and it wasn't relaunches, it wasn't variant covers, it wasn't any of that. It's like when you saw a new character on the stands, it was a new character, and you're like, I'm going to get on board and I'm going to see if this character's for me, and then I'm going to watch this character go through all these events in a almost soap operatic fashion. Is that a term? It is a term now. It was the sequential nature of like every month you'd come back, you'd get another piece of this character's story, and you were there with the character. It felt meaningful. That's not there today. It's not. You get that a lot more, of course, with the indie books, in particular that Image, let's say, because if those series don't get canceled, unless the series is meant as a mini series, but like series like Why the Last Man or Walking Dead or Invincible, like there was an intent to tell a longer story that harkened back to, let's tell a rich story that takes time to world build, that takes time to character develop, that slow burn. Let's make that slow burn meaningful again. So what's difficult when trying to crowdfund a series as an indie creator, trying to get a new idea out there, is, of course, you never know if you have the sustainability. You never know if you have the numbers to sustain your idea long enough for you to tell that slow story. And so everyone is in a rush to tell the story fast, and it's kind of like a snake eats snake scenario, right? Because the audience wants something that takes more time to develop, but the books hit the stand and they're really quick to react and really quick to absorb, really quick to make decisions that then compromise a series from being able to be long form and being able to slowly develop. So then the creators go, I can't take the time to slow burn because the audience is going to react and bounce away. So it's like, it's not in a healthy state, because it's really hard to develop a fan base and get new eyeballs and get people to believe in the work you're doing when there's nothing to form an idea around, right? So I think YouTube kind of gives a channel to offer a way for fans to connect with creators and sort of get a better sense of what the creator's intent is. I think Twitter is also there, but Twitter is a dangerous place to be, man, because Twitter could be all of those things as well. In 2007 it was. I remember being in early Twitter, and I was living in Amsterdam at the time, and traveling Europe a lot, and you could go on Twitter in those early first 2 years and go, there's a Twitter hangout happening at this bar. That's what would happen in Amsterdam, and then people would just show up because they were Twitter. You know what I mean? Like, that was a community, and it was the meaning. And it was, back then, it was like vlogging was like starting up as a thing until again corporate media then jumped in, and then corporate media took vlogging over, and then corporate media took Twitter over, and then they crashed the server. That's a whole history in and of itself, but it's like an epidemic every time. So a place to develop that kind of community is difficult, but YouTube is unique because on YouTube you own your community. Yes, YouTube does its shenanigans here and there with the search algorithms and recommendation feeds and all that stuff, but this is the creator's content reaching an audience, and the audience gets to decide if they're going to follow the creator. They're going to get behind the creator's work, and then they get a behind the scenes, a behind the curtains look at what the intent is. And so that message is direct from creator to the consumer. That is a very good thing. So that's what I'm hoping to hook into, and I'm hoping you guys as potential fans, because that's what I'm trying to do. I'm trying to just get out there to new eyeballs, and potential fans can have somewhere to go and follow along, and maybe get a bit of that feeling that, if you're a longtime reader, that you got back in the 80s, back in the early 90s. In particular, my influence, let me just get back into it. My particular influence is like the vertical line of the 80s, late 80s, early 90s. I guess through the 90s, Vertigo wasn't that bad, actually. It held its course fairly well, especially from like the stuff that influenced me. So things like Neil Gaiman's Sandman, which it's probably off screen. It's like the shelf. It's the shelf right over there. Just take my word for it. So it's Neil Gaiman's run on Sandman. It's Alan Moore's run on Swamp Thing. It's actually my chairs. Can I just, there you go, that right there, I mean, that's all Constantine. Like, that took me forever to find. Like, some of those books were very difficult to find, and the trades weren't releasing in continuity. Like, there was like holes everywhere. DC's been trying to fill them in, thankfully, and so there's like most of the run is now taken care of, and I'm caught up. But it took me years to collect the Constantine run. But yeah, Delano's run on Constantine, like the early stuff, was vital. This was content that I was 15 maybe when I started reading some of this content, 15 to 19 or something. So it's adult. It's mature content. There were mature themes in it. There was stuff that didn't pull the punches. It didn't hold you by the hands. Like and it's not just adult themes like nudity or sexual things or graphic violence or all those things that Comic Code Authority was like cracking down on. And that could be a whole other video. For those of you who don't know what Comics Code Authority was, it was like this stamp. I think it's since 1954 or something. It was a way for America to self-regulate itself with what it was publishing in the comic industry. And so it was like there was a lot of things you couldn't do, and you'd have to put your comics through this review process, and if that Comic Code Authority approved it, then you put this stamp on your book, and it let like parents know that this thing didn't have werewolves and vampires in it. Literally stupid things like that, which is what sort of killed the horror market for a while there. Again, another video, maybe. I mean, that might be a fun. Things like you couldn't put like figures of authority, like policemen, lawyers. Lawyers? Were lawyers in there? Anyways, the judges were definitely in there. You couldn't put them in compromising certain situations. You had to like maintain their position of authority. You couldn't have like drugs, for example. You couldn't have criminals come off as sympathetic. There was a whole list of things. There was like sexual deviancy. So when people are like, well, LGBT didn't really exist, it's because they couldn't. Writers had to write characters they had to be suggestive about it, but not explicit, because then it wouldn't pass the Comic Code Authority. So there's a whole history of even LGBT in comics and why there was such a gap there. It's because it was enforced. So it's a really interesting history, which the funny thing with oh my God, I'm derailing again. This is going to happen in these videos, guys. So even like Constantine, right? Like Constantine, like a big controversy. I don't know if it's big, but anyways, it's a controversy with like John Constantine's sexuality as a bisexual. Well, they're like, well, in the early Constantine, he was a straight man. I'm like, no, I I don't know. I read Constantine. I got to the point, I forget which trait it is. And so it's insinuated that he swings both ways, which, you know what? I got to that point. It's not like I thought Constantine was a bisexual, but I never thought he was straight. You know what I mean? Like I wasn't thinking about the man's sexuality, but the thing is that he was a sexual person. And so in my head, I'm like, it didn't seem weird to me. It seemed completely reasonable. And what I loved about the way that was revealed, even though it's controversial, it's like, that's sort of real life, man. Like, you don't go around like having to know people's sexuality and stuff like that. You know, it's like, and just the storytelling was natural. It wasn't forced. It wasn't in your face. It's not that there's anything wrong with that, because there's an audience for that too, but it just, I felt more like, I like that organic nature behind the characters evolving into things where you're like, oh, he's bisexual. And it just becomes like an afterthought. Anyways, that was impressive to me. I also grew up reading, I don't know if you guys are familiar, because, you know, I talk about this with people, because George R.R. Martin is everyone knows this name now, even people who didn't know him as like for his novels. So everyone knows Game of Thrones now, and so they know the name, even if they don't know the writing. I grew up, I might have been 13, maybe 12, when I started reading the Wild Card series. If like, not a lot of people know what this is, and it's like, it probably had the greatest influence on my writing, on my idea behind world building, the idea of alternate worlds. Like, again, remember, as a teenager, these were really high. Oh, I definitely derailed. The point I was trying to make before I go into Wild Cards, it wasn't even that they were mature because of the sexual stuff or the violent stuff or the evil, the nature of evil. It was that they dealt with themes and topics, especially like Swamp Thing goes into some, Sandman for sure, Constantine to some degree, right? Where it's just, it required a level of maturity to kind of get into that storytelling, because it was so layered. It was so rich. It was so rich in a way that, you know, a younger mind might not wrap itself into. Like, when I was a teenager reading through Sandman, I mean, I enjoyed it from a surface level perspective, because I like the idea that it touched on all these like multi-layered like narrative things, and because I was a big fan of myth already, and how oral tradition like affects storytelling traditions and patterns. Like, I was very early on, I was into all of this stuff, and Sandman was probably my gateway into really loving it from a writing standpoint. And even like, I think it's in that row, but like Unwritten is in there. That's another great series for people who love like literary conventions and how they might affect storytelling, because that's gets meta, super meta as well. But like, that's what I loved. I love how Sandman, pointing at all the Sandman and like Unwritten by extension, which I feel like it's like, well, at least the first 6 issues, the first trade really starts to play with that. I think it goes somewhere else after that, but I haven't caught up on Unwritten. Anyways, so I'm gonna have to derail again. It's like Swamp Thing's, the nature of you know, when Swamp, I don't want to spoil things either though. So people who have read Swamp Thing, anyways, there's something that happens there. Like, no, I'm not going to get into it. Forget it. I'm not going to spoil it. Point is if you've read Sandman, Swamp Thing, Constantine, you sort of understand the influences behind not just the surface level storytelling, not just the horror elements, that they're a little bit more subtle, the more psychological stuff, the more thinky stuff, you know, but it's the layered stuff. It's the fact that they go into themes that really make you think. They really make you think beyond what you're reading and stuff like that. Going back to George R.R. Martin's Wild Cards. Wild Cards was I'm gonna go off a memory here. It was a series that took comic books, and they're like, what if comic book heroes were in the real world? This is an alternate world, because if I recall correctly, Reagan is still president, or remains president. It's during the Cold War. It hasn't ended. It's an interesting tapestry. And so George R.R. Martin goes to all his writer friends, all his sci-fi writer friends in the 80s, and he's like, I have this idea, I want you to contribute to it. And so they all started to kind of give these like short story takes, but it all built into a world. So there was a continuity in it. George R.R. Martin, I believe he wrote some stuff, but he was more of an editor that kind of guided the storytelling. Also, a fun little trivia thing is that I believe some of these writer friends of his, they actually played tabletop together. They were tabletop buddies of his, and they were playing, I don't know if it was a champion system, I forget the RPG system they were playing, but it was basically they were taking the role playing characters and they told stories in this world that they manifested, and then it became the Wild Card series. I could be slightly wrong about that, but I don't think so. I think that's pretty much how it went. And so when you read this book and you read about these characters in the way it was written, even the way it was written, it was very adult stuff. Like, again, as a teenager, you know, I was just kind of learning about things and kind of thinking about things a little differently. I was exploring ideas of things. So like sexual dynamics and political dynamics, like all of that stuff, of course, when you're a teenager, you're going through all of that stuff. But these authors were kind of taking you down into heavy thinking. And so the premise of Wildcards, if I recall correctly, and I'm not mangling this, is that an alien spaceship flies overhead. I forget the character's name, who's the alien, but something happens, the fuel tank explodes, or some element, and the element hits New York, and it changes some of the people in New York into aces or jokers. So aces become superheroes that just look like normal human beings, but they get super enhancements. And then there's the jokers, which are characters that get deformed because of this material. And so it segments society into like a kind of a higher and lower class because of all of this. And so there's sort of social dynamics at play, there's power dynamics at play. It was so good. It was so good. And I think it was about, I don't know, maybe 7 or 8 years ago, I finally eBayed the entire series. It cost me a lot of money, man, but I wanted all of them. And they were so difficult to find. They weren't reprinted. It was a big mess, but I got them all now. So I'm derailing again. So the other series that really influenced me as a teenager was Brian Lumley's Necroscope. I don't know if you guys are familiar with this one. There's, I think, 6 books, and then there's like an offshoot. But Necroscope was like this horror tale, and if I remember this one correctly, I do. I don't remember the terms, but it was that there was like these secret agencies, and it was espionage and the KGB in particular. It's like these guys who could like. Anyways, I'm not going to get too into it because I don't want to spoil it, but it's almost like a psionic branch, or like this branch of like people who like have abilities. They uncover the Wamphiri. The Wamphiri is like, basically, if you think about Dracula, it's like uncovering what that might be. And strangely enough, it's like it's like a political horror, I guess, that goes into the history of Dracula, sort of. I'm definitely like I'm kind of keeping this loose so I don't spoil things, but a fascinating series because for a teenage brain, it was I loved vampire stuff. I collected vampire novels. I read vampire. The first thing I wrote was a vampire play for a Catholic high school. It was awesome, and I love vampire. I love the myth of it. I love the exploring the idea of it. I was a huge tabletop gamer not gamer. I was a GM, game master for the Ravenloft setting. I own all the products. Read all. I was part of the community. I loved the idea of exploring the nature of vampirism, exploring what was commonly known about the vampire and going to the next steps. And so that really activated this idea of like, you can take the seeds of things that are established in storytelling that are like core to a concept, but then you can start to say, what if, right? What if? And Marvel had a what if series, which I was also a big fan of. I think one of the famous ones is like, what if Punisher actually killed Spider-Man? Because one of the appearances of Punisher and Spider-Man is like he's like in a crosshair. I think that's one of them. Anyways, point being, and then Elseworlds. Like, I loved Elseworlds. Why did I love Elseworlds? Because Elseworlds was DC Comics basically going, what if... Again, now that I own some of them. Okay, like what if Batman was around during the 1880s, 1890s, during Sherlock Holmes era, and he was hunting down Jack the Ripper. Oh, this is a good one. So what if Superman crash landed in the Stalin era Russia, and Stalin raised him instead of the Kents, and he became the Red Sun? You know, that was a really good one too. Anyways, so I love that because it explored stuff that came before. Let's tweak something, and then let's see what happens in this alternate universe. Let's tell stories without the continuity, but respecting the continuity, and let's just have fun. Let's just have fun exploring these ideas and telling new stories with these recognizable ideas, characters, icons. And I am rambling and stuff like that, but anyways, there's my influence. I'm gonna scroll through this update real quick and see if I can get anything else that I want to talk about. There was something that I was kind of getting at when I was writing this update. I feel like writers, like creators, are nervous they're nervous about exploring the fringes of storytelling again, of, I don't know, like stuff is so safe. And I feel like creators should feel like they have the ability to be more free with their storytelling. And I think crowdfunding offers an opportunity for that. But of course, because of the nature of being able to explore a little bit more without being like, ooh, I'm just gonna be so crazy that it's gonna be for that initial impact, and isn't my premise so crazy, so cray, like look how divisive I'm being with my idea so that I can create some controversy and this will be canceled in 6 issues, you know. Those ideas can last and they can be great, you know, but sometimes I feel like I think I've gotten my point across, right? I feel like crowdfunding opens up that gateway. It's just now what needs to happen with crowdfunding is it needs to start, the community around crowdfunding needs to be nurtured in a way to sort of also anticipate that creators will take that next step to explore, man. Come up with some ideas that aren't safe from a narrative perspective. I'm not even, and let me caveat some of this because I think there might be some misperception about what I mean about things are too safe. It's the idea that storytelling doesn't have to be so surface level. And what I feel like is happening in mainstream comics in particular is that everything is playing this surface level story where you can't really go that deep. By saying that, I am reading Snyder's run on Batman. I think he's a brilliant writer. I was following him early on. I got his novel too of short stories. Like he's a great writer, and he's that kind of writer that, you know, I do trust to kind of get a little bit layered with the storytelling. The thing is, he sells so well that he has the liberty to take time and to tell these longer stories. And the Court of Owls thing was amazing. I'm not caught up, so yeah, please don't spoil me in the comments. But like the whole night stuff, the stuff with all the alternate, the Batman, because I remember covers coming up in Twitter feeds and stuff like that. That is like the Batman Who Laughs, and I'm like, what is all this stuff? It sounds crazy, and this is the kind of stuff that's only possible when you have a writer on a book for a long period of time who has a long vision in play, who has the backup of his or her publisher, so that they can keep telling this story that goes, you know, dozens of issues in. That stuff is missing in the modern market. And so people have to wrap up storylines. So of course, then writers switch, teams change, and God, sometimes the artists aren't the same on the book. So it's super disruptive from a reader standpoint to go through artistic changes that it's disruptive. So let's get back to the update and how have these thoughts influenced Raven Nevermore. I talk about it a little bit in the Kickstarter video. But Raven Nevermore starts off by playing with comic book conventions by setting the series up as a trope-fueled premise of overcommitted cop sacrifices everything he holds dear, etc., etc., etc. It doesn't matter. I don't want to spoil things, so I kind of left it at that because people might go back and pick up issue 1, so I don't want to kind of get into it. But it's a trope. If you're a surface reader, which is completely fine, and I did intentionally write this story so it works, as like a surface story. Like if you're just reading it for the events that are happening, that's going to be one story. And if you're a deep delve reader, then you're going to find hints of things that might be telling a subtextual story or a symbolism based story, however you might want to put it. It doesn't matter to me. Again, it's the influence from Sandman. It's the influence for things like Unwritten. It's just influence from inspirations from writers who would kind of do subtextual hints. It happens in mystery a lot. It happens in psychological horror a lot, with character building. But in comics, I'm like, comics is a perfect medium where you can like seed in all of these little Easter eggs, and then you just let it be an Easter egg hunt, you know? It could be the words I use. It could be the repetition. It could be, and I did show 2 panels in the update that alluded to this. So I'll put it up here so I get it right, but it's when Casey says ravens are at the window. That means someone is going to die, and the ravens are here to take their soul away. And Anastasia says to her brother, Cassius, why would you say something like that? Cassius responds, I don't know. Just a thought that came to my mind. Maybe I read it in Dad's Raven book. Now, I am kind of giving a cheeky handout to Edgar Allan Poe's The Raven, which is, of course, a massive influence on this story, on this comic book, on this character, but not in ways you'd think. And that's where it gets a little tricky, and it becomes a very complicated sell for me, because I don't want to say it's what if. That's key. So I'll come back around. What if The Raven, the poem by Edgar Allan Poe, didn't end where it ended? So that's why I added that bonus bit of content to Raven Nevermore issue 1, a poem called Forevermore, which I wrote, which is possibly filled with a bunch of stuff that is important. But you're not going to have the context, because that's how mysteries work, and that's how long form storytelling works. And you gotta be, as a writer, you gotta be in for the long haul, and you gotta sort of take the time to not feel the pressure to have to reveal things so early. But as a reader and as a fan, you gotta buy in. You gotta buy in for the long haul. You gotta buy in for the fact that you want to uncover these things, and you're in for the journey, and whatever the journey is going to be, that's what you signed up for. So why that panel is important, and I'll put the second panel up here of just the subtle bits, and this is all over the series. So if you're a fan of this stuff, it's all over the series. And so the reason why I don't want to be explicit about things is, like, part of me is like, I want to release this series because I want to know what other people find and what other people say and what they take away. Some stuff I do intentionally leave sort of ambiguous. I have ideas, but I'm like, I don't need that to mean what I think it means, but I want to leave it ambiguous enough that I want to know what the audience takes from that, because I'm kind of playing on the idea of how symbolism means something different to every reader, right? It's like it's the artist idea of, like, when an artist has a show, they're not there to explain to everybody what their artwork means, right? So, and I took a degree in fine art. That's kind of my background, although that's not what I ended up doing, but a lot of ideas from fine art that stand out to me. It's the idea of, like, how to take criticism. You get trained in that hard. It's the idea of, like, as an artist, you have an idea, you can't be there to express your idea, and so the expression of your idea needs to be in your art, and your art needs to stand on its own, and you have to be okay with every audience member, every person who visits that gallery, they're going to take whatever they're going to take away from that art, and you have to be on that same page about what your intention is of what you're trying to convey. And if it's not your intention, you take that feedback and you go, oh, that's not really what I intended. And maybe you tweak your mission statement as an artist to get a little bit better about the message you're trying to convey. So that's kind of what I want out of this series too. I do want it to be a piece of art as well. Anyways, this panel right here, you'll notice how it works is Corvin Moore gets he's okay kind of walking into danger. He's kind of been drugged at this point. He's not in a straight state of mind, but someone threatens his family, and so he reacts, and he says, you will not hurt them. Sneak gives him a good old elbow to the back, knocks him down because he's already disoriented. When he gets back up, Sneak pushes him up against a reflective surface, and what do you see? You see Corvin hallucinating this image of this raven form, and it's the caption that also becomes important, where it says "Ravens at the window," and so there's little threaded repetition that happens throughout the series that you can look out for, which is important. It is meaningful. The context of what it means is also meaningful. Oh man, I don't want to go too deep into it, because I do want you to kind of take away whatever you take away, and I'm okay with that, because I think that's part of the story, because you're like Corvin trying to work your way through this narrative that's not making any sense. It is a mystery, and you and Corvin can kind of decipher it, put it all together by the end of the series. Hopefully you get to some event that is conclusive, and the story will come to an end. The series is written as a 3-part series. It is the beginning, the middle, and the end. The beginning is the first 3 issues. The middle is the 4 to 6, and then the end is 7 to 9. They're all 30 pages each. It's the last issue's 32 pages, and it's an origin story at the end of the day. So the first 3 issues, it's the hero's journey. If you guys aren't familiar with the hero's journey, Joseph Campbell is this writer who kind of put together all of these bits and pieces from history of how storytelling worked, and what these key patterns were that existed throughout history. And so he formulated this equation of sorts. George Lucas for Star Wars was a huge fan of Joseph Campbell. the hero's journey is a huge part of the original trilogy. In Hollywood, there's the huge spec market, so people would write scripts before they even got produced. They would pay, people like Hollywood would pay millions for just ideas broken down. And this other writer called Blake Snyder took all of those things, kind of influenced by the hero's journey as well. He creates something. He writes this book. It's a really easy to read book because it's very grounded. It's very like kind of like normal speak, but it's called Save the Cat, and it's Blake Snyder breaking down almost every successful blockbuster movie equation that will work and that will sell a movie, will sell and it's just, and that alone would be able, you'd be able to put a spec script together based on this formula. And then when that started, like when he released the book, I don't know if it was because of him, but people got it, like everyone started to follow this formula, and then that sort of collapsed to a certain degree. And yeah, so I became a huge fan of patterns and formula. An early child, I had already keyed into a lot of fantasy and myth-based formulas. The idea of repetition, the idea of the rule of threes, the importance of circles or rings, the importance of symbolism of certain ideas and concepts, like the sunset, like the forest, like the path. Like there's all these like things that the more folklore you read, the more, and regardless of culture, which was especially fascinating to me, you'll see these patterns and symbolism. All of that became, all of that influences me. So when I found out about the hero's journey and Save the Cat, I kind of came up with my own sort of formula that I created based on not just those two things, but then I started researching other people's deconstruction of the formula of storytelling. I was able to put my narrative formula together, and Raven Nevermore is kind of the result of that, to be honest. I've used it to deconstruct movies, comic books, trades, novels, short stories. It's almost always that formula. It's a subconscious formula that sort of hits certain narrative beats that as an audience, we're subconsciously anticipating. And that's what it comes down to. That's the simplest way that I can explain that formula without ranting on for another half an hour. So I think that's about it. I think I got all my points across from this update. Yeah, I talk about like not pulling the punches and not holding hands. Like make it part of the experience. Like that's what you're writing a mystery. Of course, it's okay for your readers to be confused, but I think there's also a responsibility of giving the reader enough that confusion becomes part of the experience. You know, it's not just confusion for the confusion. It's not like Lost for the sake of being lost. Although I'm on record for saying I actually enjoyed Lost. Just gonna say it because of Brian K. Vaughan, then writer from Y the Last Man, he comes on to the series, and for me, he kind of corrects. He makes it work. He makes the formula work in a way that was very pleasant for someone like me who's into formulas. But there's comics that also play with the whole confusion angle in a Lost manner. I think the most Lost kind of formula series that I followed, I don't know how far I am in it, but so don't spoil me. But it's Morning Glories by Spencer. It takes place in this kind of private school, if I recall correctly, and I can't even explain it. I'm just going to say, if you enjoyed Lost and you want to see how that formula works in comic book form, Spencer's Morning Glories is a good one. One that's like richer, like super rich, like Sandman, like Neil Gaiman's Sandman rich. Yeah, it is behind me. It's unwritten by Mike Carey. If you want to get like again, I'm only like one or two trades into that one, but it starts off as this kid you feel like is kind of like a Harry Potter. He's like a stand-in for Harry Potter. But it's like, what if Harry Potter was in the real world? And I really can't give things away without sort of spoiling things. But it's literally like, take the Harry Potter storyline with Voldemort, right? It's kind of the premise of Trade 1. And that one, I would even say, suffers is a strong word, but I'm going to use it because it applies to Raven Nevermore. Is that you read the first one or two trades and you feel like the premise is one thing and then it's not. You know what I mean? And so if you buy into it because you're like, oh, it's kind of like this the story about a Harry Potter figure in the real world that's kind of uncovering this weird literary mystery that is intertwined, and it's like the secret society of literary figures. Again, I don't want to spoil things. It's very smart and it's very layered. It's layered in a, like the way that Alan Moore's Watchmen was layered. You know, also another, wasn't a huge inspiration for me, but from a storytelling perspective, it was great. Watchmen was great, but it inspired me in the sense of how layered the Watchmen was in terms of there was that surface story, and then there's that subtextual story that happens, but you don't need to be there for both. And then it's the essays that Alan Moore writes. It's just how much content is in the Watchmen. Okay, I don't have essays in Raven Nevermore, but I would if I could, you know. But yeah, it's the idea that the more you read Watchmen, the more you find things. The unwritten, Mike Carey's Unwritten is kind of like that, because there's a lot of really dense pages where they're like, it's fiction. It's like fiction on the page. It's fiction in a comic book. It's like news. I think there's like faux news articles. There's like, and you have to read everything. And then you said, because everything's kind of like a conspiracy thing. It's really good. Did I even finish the word? It's kind of like a conspiracy thing that you start to find out about, and then that's actually the story. You know, I'm going to cut around the thing I just said because it's sort of spoilery. The point is what I mean by, like, it's a little bit of a gamble that Mike Carey takes, but again, because he was able to continue that story, though, he was able to tell the story of, like, what if it's Harry Potter in the real world with this conspiracy of blah, 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 right? But then if you pass trade 2, it's like, oh, right? And then, because then he's able to explore past that and the guts of the story that he's actually trying to tell, which is about way more than the Harry Potter aspect of the trade. I don't want to spoil it. I'm going to just shut up. I didn't have an idea of what I was going to do here for the first episode. I thought it was going to be like a 10-minute episode. I was just going to talk about the update and talk about the Retrofresh. Talk about my inspirations, talk about the hidden stuff in Raven Nevermore, and that it requires some patience, and it requires a buy-in for the longer storytelling. And yeah, I'm hoping to reach out to some new readers who will give me the opportunity to tell this story, the 272-page story, and be in there for the long ride. And maybe I can tell more stories after this, which I do have more stories. In fact, I will drop something here. I mean, I've created a single issue, a one-shot, that would happen after this story. But I can only do that one shot if I get to the end of the campaign. Maybe it would be a bonus if I reach some stretch goal. I mean, the investment, the financial investment for this series is done, you know. Tens of thousands of dollars are put into this. I don't anticipate getting that all back from the audience. Definitely didn't create this with the expectation to get that money back through crowdfunding. The way I looked at it is I saw it more like schooling. I was working out the thing I talked about, the narrative framework patterns, and I was huge. I spent years trying to formulate my own kind of approach and taking other courses and listening to people, reading books, and like really researching and then formulating my own way so that I wasn't using anyone else's formula. I was using mine, you know, because then I might want to do something with that one day. And so for me, Raven Nevermore was like someone paying to go to college or university, you know, like it costs money, man. Education costs money. And so when you're a creator and I'm a new name, no one knows me. So you have to make that investment. You have to take that hit. Sure, it was rough. Sure, it put me into debt. Of course it did. And then I had to get a 9-to-5 job again. I'm in a corporate work right now so that I could fill in that debt hole. And I'm okay now. I'm restabilized. I'm actually doing fairly well so that I can do these crowdfunding campaigns and start thinking about the future. I'm thinking about where I can invest money, but I'm trying to get my life in order to a point where I can be safe again to go back to school. You know what I mean? Like Raven Nevermore was my schooling. Now it's like I need to apply that schooling in a way that can be sustainable, which comes down to crowdfunding, finding new eyeballs, getting a fan base in place that will follow me, and then we'll see what we can do from there. Because then those ideas will just start spinning again. I've got tons of ideas. I can keep going, especially with this world, because this is not just a story about Corvin Moore. Like, part of the layering that happens in Raven Nevermore was the world building. World building, as you've heard from my influences, are super important. Sandman world building was super important. The Wild Cards world was super important. These were, because that was a collective, right? It was a bunch of people coming together, but creating a cohesive idea and building that up. Tabletop role playing, super important, you know, like me following certain tabletop settings back in the 90s, Ravenloft, Planescape, Dark Sun, super important because of the world building. It's all been about the world building, and so Raven Nevermore had to be about the world building. It's for a setting I call the breach space setting, and so there's just enough there to kind of let you know there's a world around the story. It's the story, but there's a world around the story, and in this world there can be other stories. Like I have a sneak story planned. I don't want to give away any of the other characters that you haven't seen up until the end of issue 2, but maybe we'll talk about that as we go, and hopefully I'll be able to tell those stories in the future someday. I don't know how often these will drop, but whenever I have like a series of ideas in my head where I just want to like rant and talk about, maybe I'll turn on the camera, I'll just start recording, I'll chop this up in a way that makes a little bit more sense to the audience, because I understand I went all over the place. I'm not going to apologize for it, because that's just more, that's my authentic, natural way of talking. If you go to the bar with me, this is what happens. And especially if I start drinking, this is the kind of stuff you have to contend with. So, I mean, if I ever get to a convention, you guys want to go to the bar, I'll go to the bar with people. Hells yeah. Thank you for watching. Thank you for being here. If you haven't had the opportunity, please go and see the Raven Nevermore campaign. You can get issue 1 and issue 2. They're 30 pages each. I'm super excited about the backer number going up more than the funding, you know. And again, I'm not trying to make the cost of making the book back, because what the campaign is asking for is just for printing and shipping. I'll put the link in the description below so that it's easy for you guys to get there. Check out the tiers and see if it's something that interests you. And if you know anybody who's into this kind of stuff, into comics, into comics that harken back to older days where writers took some risks with the way that they told the story with longer form storytelling, share the link, put it on social media. I'm not on Facebook, so anybody who has Facebook who has access to comic book forums or fan bases that are comic fans, please share the link to the Kickstarter, and hopefully we'll get this sucker funded and we'll be able to launch issue 3 as soon as possible, all the way into issue 9. So if you haven't subscribed to the channel, please do so. If you made it this far in, man, come on, that means you're going to subscribe to this channel, right? Because you're okay with the non-linear ranty nonsense that I think I'm just going to embrace, because it's just more authentic and natural for me to do it this way. I'll chop it up so that's easy for you guys to consume. But anyways, I'm rambling on. This is the outro, damn it. Subscribe, like, share, okay? Don't forget to explore, engage, and inspire, buddy. Peace.